Hey, welcome to your personalized deep dive. This one's all about Frank Herbert's Litany Against Fear from Dune. And I got to say, you've sent in some really cool stuff about like what it means, and I'm
Yeah.
pretty stoked to dig into it with you. So we've got like the whole philosophy thing going on, psychology too, and of course like how it fits into Dune itself.
Right.
But I think what's going to really blow your mind with this one is how it gets out like fear being a mind killer. It's way more messed up than we usually think.
Yeah, and that's what I find so interesting about it, like how Herbert takes fear and makes it more than just some like passing emotion.
Yeah.
He's like presenting it as this like existential threat, almost like it's got its own kind of evil spirit or
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that can like totally twist your judgment and basically lead you to self-destruct.
Yeah, yeah. That's heavy stuff. Before we get too deep into that, though, I think we got to hear the litany itself.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always thought the way it's written, the rhythm, the words, it's like seriously powerful stuff.
I'm with you on that. It's definitely a piece of writing that's meant to be like experienced, not just analyzed.
Absolutely. Okay, here goes. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me.
Yeah.
And when it has gone past, I will tune the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear is gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain.
Whoa, just hearing that, like, you can almost feel the vastness of Arrakis, right?
Right.
The weight of all those challenges Paul Atreides is up against.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so you were talking about fear as a mind killer. Can you break that down a little more? Like, what was Herbert actually getting at there? And how did that apply to us, like in real life?
I mean, we're not exactly fighting giant sandworms every day.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so think of it this way. You're about to give a presentation, right? And the fear just hits you. But instead of like thinking clearly about your material, your mind's going crazy with all these worst case scenarios. Your palms are sweaty, your heart's pounding, all because of a rush of adrenaline.
Yeah.
But that's meant for actual danger, not, a conference room.
Right.
So what Herbert's saying is that fear, when you don't deal with it, can hijack your higher thinking and make you act all irrational.
Mm.
It's almost like fear creates this logic that doesn't actually help you at all.
No, that's interesting. So it's like fear isn't just a feeling then. It's like a force that's actually warping how we think.
Exactly.
So it's not just being scared. It's about how that fear can really lead us down the wrong path. Is that right?
Exactly.
Ah.
And you can actually see this reflected in like cognitive biases, like negativity bias. Our brains are wired to focus way more on threats than on positive things. So when that fear takes over, we like overestimate the risks and underestimate our ability to cope.
So even if we like logically know that a situation isn't as bad as it feels, fear can still kind of trap us in that messed up perception.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And this also ties into this idea of fear as an existential anxiety, a feeling we all get when we're faced with the uncertainty of life, basically. It's that unease about what we don't know, the stuff we can't control. But Herbert is saying that giving in to that fear is like a little death, a shrinking of our potential, of our spirit.
Now, he keeps using this phrase, the little death. What's the big deal with that? Is it just a fancy way of saying fear is bad for you?
It's deeper than that. Herbert links the little death to like the concept of ego death.
Okay.
Like shattering that rigid sense of self we have. It's about letting go of the limiting beliefs and defenses we cling to. And that actually can be a way to grow and become more authentic.
Huh?
You can see parallels to this in like mindfulness practices, where the goal is to just observe your thoughts and emotions without judging them. So by accepting fear instead of fighting it, we create this space for a more genuine and resilient self to come through.
So it's like dying to our fear, to those stories we tell ourselves. That can actually be a way to become more expansive, more empowered.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Wow. And the litany itself, it's kind of like a roadmap for this whole process. It doesn't say ignore your fear, but it's like face your fear and let it pass through you.
Right.
It's actively engaging with fear, understanding it, and in the end, transcending its grip on you.
Yeah, I'm noticing how the litany uses all these strong commands, right? Like face, permit, turn. It's not passive at all. It's all about action.
Right.
So it's not about just accepting fear, but about taking control of how we react to it, right?
Exactly. It's like a call to action, a reminder that we still have a choice, even when we're scared. We might not always control what makes us afraid, but we can control how we react to it. How we choose to engage with that fear.
It makes me think of, like, Stoicism, you know, that idea that suffering doesn't come from what happens to us, but from how we judge those events.
Right.
So it's not the fear itself that's the problem, but how we decide to interpret it and how we respond to it.
I think you're totally right.
Yeah.
The litany fits perfectly with that Stoic idea. Instead of trying to wipe out fear, which is impossible, we should be focusing on mastering what's going on inside us.
Right. Yeah.
Acknowledging the fear, seeing it without judgment, and then choosing a response that fits with our values and goals.
Okay, so we've talked about fear as a mind killer, this whole little death thing, and the need to, like, actively deal with fear instead of letting it take over.
Yeah.
But there's this line about turning the inner eye to see fear's path.
Mm-hmm.
What's the deal with that? What is this inner eye that Herbert's talking about?
The inner eye, it's a really powerful metaphor for introspection, like turning your attention inward to look at your thoughts, your feelings, and how you react to things.
Okay.
So when we face fear and then turn that inner eye to way it's been, we're basically breaking down the whole experience.
Right.
We're asking ourselves, like, okay, what triggered this fear? How did my body react? What thoughts popped up? What did I actually do?
So it's like becoming a detective of our own fear, like tracing it back to the beginning and figuring out how it affects us.
Right.
But how does that actually help us move past fear?
Well, by understanding our patterns, our triggers, we start to gain like a sense of control.
Okay.
We realize that fear isn't just this big, overwhelming blob. It actually has structure. It comes from somewhere. And that knowledge, that's super empowering because it lets us start to change how we relate to fear.
This reminds me of how therapists use, like, cognitive behavioral therapy
Right.
to help people challenge and reframe those negative thought patterns. It's about recognizing the thoughts that are feeding the fear and choosing to replace them with something better, something more constructive.
Exactly. It's about realizing those stories we tell ourselves about fear and asking, are they even true? The inner eye lets us become aware of those stories and then decide if we want to keep believing them.
Okay, so turning the inner eye inward helps us understand our own relationship with fear. But you said before that the inner eye can also be turned outward. What did you mean by that?
Well, we can use that same awareness, that same like critical lens, and look at how fear works in the world around us. Think about how often fear is used to manipulate and control people,
Right.
especially in like politics and the media.
Yeah, for sure.
We're constantly bombarded with messages that play on our anxieties, fear of the other, fear of, economic collapse, fear of losing our freedoms.
Yeah.
And by turning the inner eye outward, we can start to see through those tactics, to recognize when someone is trying to use our fears against us.
That's a really good point. It's easy to get swept up in those stories of fear, especially when they're everywhere.
Right.
But the litany's reminding us to be careful, to question where those fears are coming from, and to resist being manipulated.
Exactly. And that's where courage comes in.
Okay.
It takes real courage to question the status quo, to challenge those stories that might be convenient or comfortable, but actually they're harmful.
Right.
The inner eye helps us see through the illusions of fear, but it's courage that gives us the power to actually do something about it.
This brings us back to Paul Atreides in Dune. He's always facing these situations that are totally scary.
Right.
But he uses the litany to get through those challenges, to make choices that fit with his values, even when it's super hard.
Yeah, his story is like a perfect example of how the litany works in real life. Paul doesn't become fearless. He learns to face his fears, to use them to grow and transform.
Right.
He doesn't run from danger, but he goes towards it with awareness, with a clear understanding of what's at stake and sticking to his own moral compass.
That's a great model for all of us,
Yeah.
to approach life's challenges with both courage and awareness, to use fear as a guide instead of letting it control us. But let's get even more specific. Our listener is dealing with their own mind killers, everyday fears and anxieties that might be holding them back. How can they actually apply the litany to their own situation?
Well, it starts with figuring out what those specific fears are.
Okay.
What are the situations, the thoughts, the feelings that trigger that fear response?
Right.
Maybe it's like a fear of public speaking or fear of failing or fear of being rejected. Once they figure out those fears, they can start using the principles from the litany.
So step one is awareness. What comes after that?
Acceptance. Instead of trying to fight the fear or push it away, they can practice allowing it to be there without judging it.
Okay.
This could be like mindfulness techniques, deep breathing exercises, or even just saying something like, hey, fear, I see you, but you're not going to control me.
That sounds kind of hard. Isn't it, like, natural to want to fight fear to try and make it go away?
It is natural, but fighting it actually often makes it worse.
Right.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The harder you push, the harder it's going to come back up. By accepting that fear is there, we loosen its hold. It's still there, but it doesn't have the same power over us anymore.
Okay, so we've got awareness, we've got acceptance. What's the next step in this process?
The next step is to actually do something about the fear, something constructive.
Okay.
Remember, the litany says, I will face my fear. This doesn't mean being reckless, but it does mean taking action, even though you're scared.
Right.
So if the listener is afraid of public speaking, maybe they start practicing in front of a mirror,
Okay.
then with a friend, and slowly work their way up to bigger groups. If it's a fear of failure, maybe they break down their goal into smaller steps, and celebrate each win along the way.
So it's about taking those small but consistent actions that build momentum and chip away at the power of fear.
Exactly. And every time they face that fear and come out okay on the other side, they're basically proving to themselves that they're stronger than their fear. They're building resilience, showing themselves that they can handle challenges and come through it all in one piece.
It's like the litany's almost a type of exposure therapy,
Yeah,
gradually getting used to the things we're afraid of by facing them over and over in safe ways.
that's a great way to put it. And as they practice facing their fears, they can also turn that inner eye inward, and think about the experience.
Right.
What went well? What were the tough parts? What can they learn from this encounter with fear?
So it's not just about overcoming the fear in that moment, but actually learning from it and using that to become more resilient and more self-aware in the future.
Exactly. And that's what makes the litany so powerful for personal growth. It's not a quick fix. It's a lifelong practice of facing our fears, understanding them, and eventually rising above them.
It's amazing how these ideas from Dune, from this made-up world, can apply so directly to our own lives.
Right.
We're not fighting sandworms, but we all have our own mind killers to deal with.
And that's what makes Dune such a timeless and relevant story. It speaks to that universal human experience of fear, but it also gives us a way forward, a way to deal with those challenges and come out stronger on the other side.
It's been really eye-opening to unpack these ideas with you. You've given us such a clear and compelling way of understanding how fear works and how we can use the litany against fear to take back our power. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to hear your thoughts on one more part of the litany that I find really intriguing.
Absolutely. I'm happy to. What's on your mind?
Well, the litany stresses facing fear, letting it pass through us, and then turning that inner eye to see its path.
Right.
But it ends with a pretty stark statement. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. It sounds like Herbert saying that fear can be completely wiped out, that we can reach a state of like pure fearlessness. Is that even possible? And does it contradict the idea that fear is just a natural part of being human?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question, and it gets to like the core of what Herbert's trying to say, I don't think he's saying that we can like totally get rid of fear. I mean, fear has a purpose, right? It keeps us safe. It's part of how we survive.
Right.
But I think that line where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. It's pointing to a way of being where fear doesn't control us anymore.
So it's not about erasing fear completely, but more about like changing how we relate to it.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You're standing on a beach, and this wave of fear comes crashing over you.
Okay.
Now, before you might have freaked out, fought it, or just run away.
Yeah.
But now you stand strong, you let the wave pass through you, and you just watch it without judging it.
Right.
The wave's still there, it still has power, but it doesn't control you anymore. It doesn't define who you are.
That's a really powerful image. It's like you have this mastery over fear,
Yeah.
a sense of peace and resilience, even when things are tough. But how do we actually get to that point? Is it just about saying the litany over and over, or is there more to it?
I think it's about living the ideas of the litany every day.
Okay.
It's about being aware, practicing acceptance, and taking action, even when you're scared, and also realizing that it's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
We're going to mess up sometimes. We're going to let fear get the best of us.
Yeah.
But the important thing is to keep practicing, to keep looking inward with that inner eye, and to keep choosing courage over giving in.
So it's like building muscle memory for dealing with fear. The more we do it, the easier it becomes. Like, it's just who we are.
Exactly. It's like learning any new skill, you know? At first it's clunky and uncomfortable, but with practice it becomes smoother, more natural, and eventually it becomes just part of how we live.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to understand what Herbert's getting at. It's not about being some superhuman who never feels fear, but about having a strong, healthy relationship with it. But, there's still this part of it that's like, okay, even if we can deal with our own fears, what about everyone else's? What about how fear is used to manipulate people and control them, to create division and conflict in the world?
That's a really important question, and I think the litany actually has something to say about that too. Remember, we talked about using the inner eye to look at how fear works in society.
Right, right.
And when we do that, we can start to see the patterns, the tactics, the ways fear is used as a weapon to get what people want. And being aware of that, that's the first step towards challenging those systems, resisting the stories that just create more fear and division.
So it's not just about dealing with our own fears, but seeing how fear is used to control other people and then doing something to stop it.
Exactly, and that's where the litany's focus on courage is so important. It takes courage to stand up to injustice, to challenge the stories that are harmful, even when it's scary or even dangerous. But by working on our own inner strength, by facing our own fears, we become able to act with integrity and compassion, even when everyone else is afraid.
It's like by mastering our own fears, we become less easily manipulated, less
Yeah.
likely to be swayed by all those fear-mongering stories that aren't good for us or for the world.
You've got it. When we're consumed by our own fears, it's easy for someone to take advantage of that.
Right.
But when we build that inner resilience, when we learn to face fear with awareness and courage, we become more discerning.
Right.
We're more empowered to choose our own path, and we're less likely to be controlled by other people's fears.
That's a really powerful message. It's like even when the world feels full of fear and uncertainty, we can still choose something different. We can choose courage and act with integrity.
And that's really what the Litany Against Fear is all about. It's a call to action, inviting us to step into our power, to embrace our full potential, and to build a world based on compassion, wisdom, and courage.
This has been such a great deep dive.
Yeah.
We've uncovered so much wisdom from what seemed like such a simple piece of writing. You've helped us see the Litany Against Fear as more than just like a literary thing, but as a real tool for personal and collective growth.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you. And I really hope our listeners feeling inspired to embrace what the litany says and to find their own courage when they face challenges in life.
I'm sure they are. So to our listener out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Litany Against Fear. May you find the strength and wisdom to face your own mind killers and help create a world where fear doesn't rule.